For 40 days on God, Family, and Guns, we'll be focused on God. We have a series on spiritual warfare, the end of times, the prophecy of Daniel, and the prophecy of Malachi. If you want to see our gun-related or Second Amendment-related content, you can see that on Patreon or the History of Weapons. Those links are below. Understanding the prophecies of Daniel, it's very important to understand where it is Daniel came from and who is the man Daniel, because in the end, what we often see when we study the book of Daniel is we kind of blast past the first several verses, because really anytime I've even seen a movie on Daniel and they show the fall of Jerusalem, it almost seems like the king of Babylon rides in, and then later on that night, Jerusalem falls and he leads everybody off into captivity. However, that's not how it played out. And it's very important that we understand, if we're going to study the book of Daniel verse by verse, that we understand every single verse. So if we take a look, beginning in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Aspenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who has ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Now, ultimately, what you got going on here is Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, king of Babylon, has conquered Judah and Jerusalem, and not only has he conquered it, but he has taken away the articles from the temple. That's really important. We talked about that last episode. Those different treasuries from the house of God are going to play a huge role in the prophecies of Daniel moving forward. So it's important that we just kind of make that note, put a little sticky note on it. He took those treasuries off. But he also then takes some of the noble men, young men. He's essentially looking for slaves who are worthy enough to work in the king's palace, who are handsome and well educated and can present themselves to the king and his people. And he's led them off into captivity as well. But to understand this captivity, how this played out, because again, if you look at any sort of when people talk about the book of Daniel, give instruction on the book of Daniel, make a movie about the book of Daniel, it's often this Nebuchadnezzar came, he besieged it, led them off, and now let's go on with the book of Daniel. But it's critical we don't jump there, because he conquered it when Jehoiakim was king. Now, Jehoiakim was an evil king. We talked about him in the last episode. But if we look at 2 Chronicles, this besiegement didn't just play out overnight. It took years to play out, and we see this in detail in the 2 Chronicles starting in 36, and we'll just go to where Jehoiakim became king. It says in 5, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him in bronze fetters and carried him off to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried off some of the articles from the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations which he did and what was found against him, indeed they are written in the book of Kings of Israel of Judah. Then Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. Now, and we went back in the last episode, looked at these atrocities which he did, which is kind of leading to why Israel is falling in the first place. But this besiegement, this leading off of Daniel, really has not taken place yet as we read 2 Chronicles, so we have to read on. Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months and 10 days, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. At the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar summoned him and took him to Babylon with the costly articles from the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem. So now we're on the third king since the besiegement began. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He also did evil in the sight of the Lord his God, did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. And he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who made him swear an oath by God, but he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord God of Israel. Moreover, all the leaders and the priests and the people transgressed more and more according to all the abominations of the nation, and defiled the house of the Lord which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. So ultimately what you have is you have this besiegement. You have King Nebuchadnezzar kind of ruling Jerusalem from afar, appointing kings, but he has not destroyed them yet, nor led them off into captivity yet. It's just kind of almost like he's governing from afar, but yet the people are only getting worse in the sight of God. Let's pick it up in 15. And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, till the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young men or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures from the king and his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then he burned the house of God, broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the reign of the king of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. So ultimately what you had is you had many, many years and the exchange of kings, until finally, in this downfall of Judah and Jerusalem and into God's eyes, until finally there was no remedy in God's eyes. And then they burnt down the temple, burnt down the city, tore down the walls, and carried them away. So now if we go back to Daniel, and that's kind of the point of really seeing all this, is that people blast past what's taking place here. It's a fall of godly men, and if we look again in 1 verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now keep in mind he reigned for 11 years. So just in the third year, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then that went on for many more years. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles in the treasury house of his God. So this continued through 2 more kings. Then finally, the king instructed Aspenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And there is Daniel. Daniel is one of those men. So, again, and I wanted to take this time to talk about, we talked about what the fall, the state of worship that led to their fall in God's eyes. And then just the evilness of King Jehoiakim. But now to see that it's not just that, Nebuchadnezzar just rolled in one day, conquered it, and took everybody out. This went on for many, many years, many cycles of different kings, until its final fall. But they only got worse. God continued to give them the chance to escape this, because in the end it's not King Nebuchadnezzar that did it. it's God that did it. He put a hook in Nebuchadnezzar and led him to Jerusalem to besiege it, to punish them because they did not rest on the Sabbath, the land. And so he says, well, for 70 years, I'm going to rest the land. If you're not going to rest it, I'll rest it for you. Which is another good lesson to learn. You don't mess around with the Sabbath. So there you go. I hope these are helping. We're going to kind of get into, well, then what then was Daniel going through? You know, what was him and his friends going through as they were being led off and kind of learning this way of the Chaldeans. So hope these videos are helping. Love to hear your thoughts on all this. Put it in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel to Patreon, that link is below. But the most important part of this channel, we take prayer requests, and never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.